This case takes place in Australia and spans over a number of years. Raymond Edmonds was born on the 12th of March 1944 at the Queen Victoria Hospital in Melbourne, Australia. Raymond, also known as Ray, was adopted as a child but didn't find out until his teenage years. Ray's adopted father, Harold, was a tough businessman with his fingers in many pies, but he was known for trading farmland. Harold demonstrated a lack of respect for his wife. He was an extroverted, bullish, womanizing man. Ray's mother was small in stature and quite timid, so Harold dominated in most ways. Despite this, Raymond was the glue within their family and held the family together. Their parents doted over Ray, and they spoiled him a great deal. Ray was privileged, and he always got what he wanted. This impacted his early life. Being spoiled made him a difficult person to be friends with. Because of this, he became a bit of a loner, but sought solace in his trumpet and became an outstanding player. When Ray was a preteen, his mother was deeply concerned by his tendency of wetting the bed. In an act of compassion, Ray's mother tried to get him help from psychiatric doctors. They prescribed Ray a medication intended to stop him from wetting the bed. However, in retrospect, the doctor realized that he had prescribed Ray the wrong medication. The doctor had prescribed him a pill containing strong hormones which were known to bring about early puberty. Besides this, and travelling about a lot in his early years, Ray was relatively stable, with nothing untoward occurring. Especially nothing that foreshadowed his future disturbing actions. By the time he was a young adult, Ray was a strapping man. He was 6 feet tall and weighed 11 stone. He was lean but very strong, and always wore a leather jacket. Whilst most men and some women were very keen on him, some women thought he was God's gift, and he soon made socializing with women a top priority, and that was when he met his future wife. In 1960, in the town of Yarrawonga, Raymond met a girl named Leslie. Leslie was 16 years old. She had bags of confidence and was known for being desired by many. Raymond wasted no time impregnating her with their first child, Susan. Then, within a year, the couple got married, although Raymond was not very faithful. He would go out to the town under the guise of playing his trumpet at the local bars, when in reality, he was off meeting other women. When Leslie was giving birth to Susan, Ray showed little interest, as during this time he was having an affair with another woman. Day to day, Raymond worked as the labourer on a local farm, but the prospects were pretty low. After a year and a bit, the couple had another child on the way, Raymond Harold Jr. So in 1964, Ray decided that he must become a share farmer if he wanted to make a good living from farming. Raymond contacted a farmer who had a series of irrigation farms, orchards, and cattle and pig farms. This was located northeast of Shepparton. Raymond got the job, packed up his wife and 2 children, and headed to the farm to start a new life. This made Raymond happy for a while. However, his lack of respect for women and his disinterest in his wife led to him becoming abusive. The family moved into a large, semi-rundown white farmhouse, and this would soon become the setting for Leslie's living nightmare. Once the family had settled in, it wasn't too long before Ray began prowling the local towns for the affection of other women. He would often come home with lipstick all over his face, but Leslie knew better than to ask about it. She had done this before, and questioning Ray only led to horrific beatings. Leslie would often work around the farm. She would milk the cattle whilst rearing 2 children of her own. This was disheartening when she saw Ray knock off early to try his luck with other local women. On numerous occasions, Leslie would get back to the house after a long day's work, only to see another woman in her maternal bed with Ray. Her emotional and physical abuse was constant, but Leslie was very young, naive, isolated, and had 2 children. She hoped desperately that things may improve in time. In late 1964, Leslie was sick of working to earn money for Ray to go out and to spend their wages. Ray would leave Leslie, Raymond Jr. and Susan with no food on many occasions. Sometimes all they would eat all day would be some cream from the farm. Raymond didn't mind at all, as he would just eat out. On one occasion, Leslie had seen that Ray had returned from the bank, so she ran to the glove box of his car and took the wages before he could head back out and spend it. For the first time, she was going to rebel. When Raymond found out, he went into a murderous rage. He marched into the house and confronted Leslie. He punched, smacked, and threw Leslie until she was black and blue. The young children were utterly traumatized and began screaming, but this did not deter Ray. Leslie heard the screams of her children over the sound of intense ringing in both of her ears. She ran to her children and tried to comfort them, but Ray continued his onslaught in front of the kids. As the three victims of Ray's domestic abuse gazed up at him, pleading for him to stop, he struck one final blow. He hit Leslie so hard on the arm that he broke her bone. Following this, Leslie left the house with the two children to live with her parents, but tragically, she had to return 2 weeks later, as there was not enough room for her and the children. Leslie was stuck, and it wasn't too long before that Leslie was pregnant again with their third child. Leslie had nowhere to go and nowhere to turn. She was living a life of despair. At around this point, Ray began acting very strangely. He became a peeping Tom, and he would watch women through their windows as they slept at night. Back on the farm, he started to become more and more violent towards the animals, and was reported to have beaten a dog and cow to death, and Leslie was living in fear. Ray would sometimes play pranks on her. An example Leslie recounted was that he once said that he was going out to play in his band, but in reality he had stayed at home and removed the bulbs from many of the household lights. He made noises to trigger and scare Leslie and the children, only to jump out at them for his amusement. Now this next part is truly disturbing. On one occasion, Leslie allegedly walked in on Raymond forcing himself upon his own daughter Susan. Around this time, she was only 3. By 1966, the nearby town of Shepparton was booming with a population of 15,000. The town was being enriched by the local agricultural industry and was adopting the California model. Drive-in theaters, diners, bowling alleys, fine restaurants and coffee shops were all being introduced nearly at the rates of new housing estates. But the main attraction was the new Civic Center, a building that would host concerts and dances throughout the week. On the 10th of February 1966, the Civic Center was hosting the long-awaited musical show called The Mod Spectacular. 18-year-old Gary Haywood and 16-year-old Abina Madil attended the concert with some of their friends. Abina was in a relationship with another man named Ian, but after the night ended, Gary and Abina drove to a secluded paddock near a lake. As Abina and Gary drove off together, nobody knew what they were planning. There was speculation that the two had a love affair, but this is just speculation. However, we do know their fates. The following information was ascertained through the criminal investigation. Whilst in the secluded paddock near the lake, Abina and Gary attracted the attention of Ray. Ray was armed with his .22 caliber semi-automatic Mossberg rifle. He ambushed the two teenagers at gunpoint and told them to get into Gary's car. He then forced them to drive 37 kilometers to an even more secluded area. They got out of the car and walked into a nearby field. Gary ordered Abina to remove her stockings, and Raymond used these stockings to bind Gary in preparation for the final horrific act. With Gary restrained, Ray began to undress Abina from the waist down. Ray subsequently forced himself upon Abina in a violent and horrific essay. However, there was a moment where Ray lost control and Abina began to run away. But Ray was able to catch up to her. Once she was in his clutches, he began hitting her in the head over and over again. Ray bludgeoned her so badly that her skull was crushed and she died from the extreme trauma to the brain. Ray then walked over to Gary, who was still restrained, and shot him in the head with his .22 caliber rifle. These were Raymond's first known murders. Gary and Abina were reported missing. It wasn't long before that the police commenced their investigation. First, they thought it was a typical runaway situation. Abina's boyfriend, Ian Urquhart, was reported to have cursed the couple and threatened to belt Gary once he found him. However, Gary's car was soon found abandoned. Everyone in the town who knew Gary knew he would never leave his beloved car. When the car was recovered, this raised suspicion that Abina's boyfriend, Ian Urquhart, was responsible for their disappearance. A few days after their disappearance, two 17-year-old boys were out on a shooting trip when they stumbled upon the badly decomposed bodies of Gary and Abina. This led to Ian being arrested, and he was subsequently beaten by the police. However, it soon became clear that Ian had no involvement in the murders. Nevertheless, he was scorned by the town as being the probable killer, a label that stuck until his tragic accidental death 6 years later. The investigation into the murders had an abundance of malpractice, poor handling of evidence, and pure negligence. The case soon went cold and wasn't solved until over 19 years later. Soon after, Raymond and his family moved to northeastern Victoria. He got a job at an abattoir. He was a good butcher and was good with knives. Life was relatively normal for Ray and his family. That was until they broke up after a horrific argument that involved a shotgun. Their relationship fell into chaos, and this was well overdue. However, it wasn't too long before Leslie found another man, but unfortunately, she left her 3 children with Ray, despite their history of abuse. Leslie didn't see her children for 4 years. Ray then hired a housekeeper named Colleen Knight, who would become his second wife. Ray and Colleen took their combined 6 children and moved to Melbourne, where Ray worked as a tramline worker and a security guard at night. Because of this, Ray and Colleen hired a 14-year-old babysitter to look after their children from when Colleen started work and Ray finished. Some sources report that Ray would come home from work and force himself upon the babysitter multiple times. The details surrounding this were sparse, and the case only came to light following a series of assaults carried out in the Donvale area of Melbourne. In 1971, in a suburb called Donvale, a 25-year-old woman named Susan had just put her 2 young children and 1 newborn baby to sleep. Her husband was out meeting friends, so she thought she would take advantage of this time and clean her floors. As she entered the laundry room to grab a bucket, she noticed a figure of a man. For a split second, she thought it was her husband who had come home early, but then she noticed the stocking face mask. This was not her husband. This was Raymond Edmonds. Susan screamed in pure shock, but armed with his long kitchen knife, Raymond rushed towards and grabbed her. Raymond said, "Keep quiet. Don't scream, and I won't hurt you." He said this in a Scottish accent. Raymond first demanded money, but when Susan said that she didn't have any in the house, he proposed that she must pay in other ways. Raymond then said, "Well, you better get undressed then." Susan replied by telling Ray that she had just given birth and she still had pregnancy stitches, but this wasn't going to stop Ray. He knew the woman had just given birth, as he had been stalking her for several weeks. Ray said, "I know about the stitches. I won't hurt you." Ray tied her hands with stockings behind her back and then tied her feet. He then placed her onto a chair and proceeded to force himself upon her. Once he had finished, Ray ran out of the house, leaving behind barefooted footprints and a horrific aroma. The smell left behind by Ray was described as a horrid mixture of stale milk, manure, and chemicals. Because of this, he was given the nickname Mr. Stinky by the media. In August of 1972, he invaded the home of another woman. He awoke this lady by brandishing a 12-inch blade. She pleaded, saying that her husband would be home soon and that there were guests in the house. Ray knew that these were lies and knew her husband had left the city for several days. He threw the blanket over the cot at the side of her bed and then repeatedly forced himself upon her. Raymond Edmonds continued his reign of terror. His modus operandi was clear. He would stalk and spy Melbourne women. These women were mostly in their 20s with young children. He would wait outside their homes, surveilling them. He would take notes of the times their husbands would leave and return. He knew how long he had to enter, commit the crimes, and then leave. He also knew the women would be more cooperative, as they would do almost anything to make sure that Ray would not harm their children. He was always barefooted and had a particularly nasty stink. Many of these cases have limited details, with the victims' names being protected. However, what is known is that in 1976 he burgled a woman in Wheelers Hill and pleasured himself in front of her. The next year in 1977, he upped the ante by committing 3 aggravated burglaries, assaults, and 3 counts of SA on 5 separate women. On one of these attacks in 1977, a young daughter and her son were forced to hear the horrific abuse. Raymond was reported to have said to the woman, "I just want to make love." It is believed that Ray forced himself upon over 30 women. The police were busy trying to find the culprit and created a sculpture of who they believed was responsible. Yet from 1971 to 1984, Ray was able to carry out these horrific crimes. The police were able to get fingerprints from the crime scenes, but unfortunately, Ray's fingerprints had never been registered with the police, so the hunt for Mr. Stinky was a difficult one, and one that would take the detectives a while to piece together. While the search for Mr. Stinky was underway, there was an unusual twist of fate. A young investigator was looking over fingerprint evidence for several cold cases, trying to rustle up some new leads. This detective noticed that a composite fingerprint collection which was attributed to Mr. Stinky matched the fingerprints taken on Gary Haywood's car. This was a shocking revelation, and one which gave the detectives hope, but also instilled some fear, now realizing that Mr. Stinky was capable of murder. A task force was created in 1983 to seek out this perpetrator. But after 2 years, the task force was reduced to a small team with no further leads. Ray was able to slip through the net. That was until Ray made his last mistake. On the 16th of March 1985, in a town called Albury in New South Wales, Ray decided to head to a supermarket and pleasure himself in his car. Several customers alerted the attention of shopkeepers to what Ray was doing. In complete shock, they decided to call the police. As the police arrived, Raymond continued what he was doing. He had no shame, even when the police were at the side of his car. Raymond was arrested on the spot. Whilst at the police station, his fingerprints were taken. He wasn't in jail for long, and he was released on bail. But once the fingerprints had arrived at the centralised fingerprint bank in Sydney, they were processed. One detective noticed them and thought they looked very similar to the fingerprints attributed to several cold cases. Cold cases that were attributed to Mr. Stinky. A team of police were assembled, and Ray was arrested at his place of work. Ray was confronted with the fingerprint evidence and began to realise that he was finished. The police had him for numerous essays and the double murder. Ray then turned to a police officer and said, "Get me a priest, I will tell you everything." Raymond got his priest, and then he started talking and admitted to 30 crimes. However, in the state of Victoria, the police were limited in the time they had to question a suspect of a crime. This was a strange rule, but it could be extended. In Ray's case, they had 2 extensions, making the police interview time 18 hours. But this still wasn't enough. Ray had admitted to 30 crimes. Ray was midway through admitting to a particular crime before their interviews were cut short. He was admitting to another murder. but because of the laws and rules, they had to stop the interview. In the end, only 5 of the 30 essays and the double murder in Shepperton were substantially confessed to so that the details could be corroborated with the evidence. Raymond was found guilty of the murders of Gary and Abina, and of 5 counts of SA. He was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years, a horrifically lenient sentence. Whilst incarcerated in 1992, he managed to get past one set of checkpoints in the prison complex and was extremely close to escaping. Fortunately, a good boy called Sarge was able to sniff him out. In 2019, when Raymond was a 75-year-old prisoner, he was charged with even more crimes. Another 8 brave women and the babysitter who I mentioned earlier came forward, and they detailed the horrific crimes that Ray had inflicted upon them. These cases were similar to his modus operandi. He invaded their homes and forced himself upon them. One of the women tried to fight back. News reports show that Raymond battered her and disfigured her face. It is suspected that the only reason this woman survived the beating was because her elderly mother came home and scared him off. With these extra charges, Raymond was ultimately given an extra 23 years and 5 months added onto his sentence, which means that Raymond will never leave prison and his victims get the justice they deserve, although it is believed that Ray has essayed over 100 women throughout his life.
The murderer, known as Mr. Stinky, who spent decades terrorising his victims across Melbourne, has admitted to more attacks against mothers and pregnant women. His lawyer told the court the rapist deserves credit for cleaning up his outstanding crimes. Court reporter Eliza Rugg.
Raymond Edmonds is resigned to the fact he will die in jail for murdering 2 Shepperton teenagers in 1966. Today, the killer, known as Mr. Stinky for his foul body odour, confessed to ruining more lives. 2 of the women were pregnant. Others had children sleeping metres away as the rapist told their mothers, "I'm not going to hurt you, I just want to make love to you." One of the victims is now 73 years old. She says she continues to live in fear and she feels like she's unworthy. Meanwhile, Raymond Edmonds, he's enjoying his time working in the prison kitchen at Port Phillip, and he still has regular visits from his second wife.
Ray has never shown any remorse for his actions. What's worse is that he doesn't even take responsibility either. He told his psychiatrist that he was drunk when he committed these crimes. Before we leave the case of Mr. Stinky there is one more victim that must be discussed. One cold case that Raymond began confessing to during his final round of police interviews was the case of Elaine Jones. Sadly, the police could not gain enough evidence at the time to charge him with this case, and he later denied any involvement. Elaine Jones and her husband Alan and their 2 daughters were camping in the town of Tocumwal. On Thursday the 3rd of January 1980, Elaine, then aged 39, left their tent at 9:30 p.m. to walk the town's shops for cigarettes and some chocolate. She walked along the quiet dirt road with a torch, wearing blue jeans, blue sneakers and a white knitted top. That night, her husband Alan Jones was not feeling very well, so he decided to stay behind in the tent. The family knew the area well, and they knew it to be safe. Tragically, Elaine never returned from the shop that night. Allegedly, Elaine ran into Raymond, who lived nearby at the time. When Alan realised that his wife was missing, he alerted the police. Next, Alan got into his boat and set off along the Murray River with his youngest 7-year-old daughter to look for his wife. Alan tragically found his wife's naked body snagged on a river log. When placing his wife into the boat, Alan saw that her throat had been severed from ear to ear, with her head nearly decapitated. Elaine's head had also been severely bashed, and it was later determined that she had been horrifically SA'd. Alan needed to get the body back to the campsite, but the sight was all too shocking for him. As he set off back to the camp, the 51-year-old's heart gave way due to the shock. Alan collapsed and died instantly. This left the poor 7-year-old on a boat alone with her 2 dead parents, with the engine still running, on a crash course with the shore. Luckily, the girl managed to switch off the boat and swam to shore to get some help. The case of Mr. Stinky is truly horrific, and despite the severity and the scale of the crimes, it is a relatively unknown case. As of right now, Raymond is 80 years of age and will remain behind bars for the rest of his life.